The Australian Financial Review.
Across the world, in countries rich and poor, fertility rates are falling, and fast.
63% of the world's population lives in areas where the fertility rate is no longer high enough to renew the next generation.
It's a global fertility crisis that has economists worried about labour shortages and inflation, and world leaders competing to fill the baby gap. Not so long ago, we were talking about runaway population growth and living sustainably. Now the fears are focused around too few people, not too many.
People who've been proponents of big countries, they've always made the assessment that big countries are powerful countries. When you have more people, you have more geopolitical clout.
Next week, the Australian government will host an economic reform roundtable. And in the lead-up, there's even been some campaigning for a return of the baby bonus.
Former Prime Minister John Howard and the Coalition are putting pressure on Treasurer Jim Chalmers, urging the government to bring back the baby bonus scheme as the country faces low fertility rates.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. This week, senior writer Miriam Robin on how worried we should be about declining fertility rates, whether they could and should be reversed, and why politicians in Australia are so reluctant to talk about it. It's Thursday, August 14. Hi Miriam, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're hearing more and more about the global fertility crisis. How bad is it? Why is there now such a sense of alarm?
There's a sense of alarm because fertility has declined at a much faster rate than has been projected. So you have this sort of situation where everywhere is falling. Some places are falling really, really low, like Korea is now down to 0.7 children per woman, which is really quite alarming. The world's two largest countries, being China and India, they're at 1 and 2 children per woman respectively, down from 1.7 and 2.4 only a decade ago. So France for a long time had quite good rates, but that's fallen from 2 to 1.7 in just 10 years. And even Indonesia, to our north, they're actually down to just basically at replacement. That's the rate at which your population neither grows or declines. So in the OECD, only Israel, South Africa and Saudi Arabia are comfortably above the replacement rate, but even there, it's falling. So Australia's sort of in the middle of that pack. We have an average of 1.5 children per woman. That's more than Canada, and it's probably a little bit lower than America, which is another country that historically has had quite a good rate. But the steepness of the decline is really starting to worry people, and it's sort of led to quite different global projections for population growth. So if you look at when we hit 6 billion people were expecting that we'd soon hit 12 billion people. Actually, demographers now think global populations will peak at 8 billion and then start to decline, and that's projected to happen in the 2050s. And also there's the fact that nowhere has really sustainably reversed the fertility decline. And so we're really probing how low can they go? And if you follow this out, well, where do you end up? And the answer is somewhere pretty unprecedented and maybe kind of scary.
So Miriam, why are people having fewer babies?
A lot of this is just about healthcare, whether it's better contraceptive or just the fact that children now are far more likely to survive early childhood. So there is far less of a need to have a lot of children just to end up with a family. So that's a big part of it. And if you look at rates of people who get married, they're actually having babies at far higher rates than the average figures would suggest. But fewer people are getting married. Also, there's the cost of living pressures that are placed on people of childbearing years now. So if housing is very expensive, if it takes a very long time to be educated and to actually working in the workforce, you probably don't want to leave it to have children after a few short years. So there's all of these economic things that discourage people from prioritizing having children in the years where they're able to easily. So, I think those are just some of the reasons, and they're far more global than you would necessarily expect.
So then what does the world look like with fewer people? What are the impacts of falling fertility rates?
So the way to think about this is even if you still have a lot of people in your society, more of those people will be older and fewer of them will be younger. So that has a bunch of economic impacts. So I guess the most obvious one is labour shortages, if you have fewer people who are in working ages. And then there's also productivity decline. So that often goes hand in hand with the effect of the ageing population. If there's fewer people doing productive work, that declines how much your society is producing. But also, when we have an ageing population, we have to devote more of society's resources into care sectors and the like. And these are not areas that historically have very high productivity because they're not very mechanized and they're very much people-to-people transactions. And even if you have high migration, which is coming in, migrants often have low productivity for a while until they become very well integrated into the labour force. So there's not too much good news on the productivity front. In terms of interest rates, you can get really interesting long-term effects. So something that's been hypothesized a lot is that older societies tend to save a lot more. So then what you end up getting with is just huge amounts of money that can be invested. And that has the impact of lowering the sort of real interest rates that a society will have. There will always be a lot more money to invest and there are good investment opportunities. So that will tend to inflate asset prices. It's not really good for house prices. In the very, very long term, if there's fewer people, you would think that house prices should fall. But in the medium term, a lot of the economic effects are really not very good. And then, you have just lower economic growth. So there have been a lot of studies done around what proportion of economic growth is related to just population growth. And it's actually a lot of it is the answer. So if you look at advanced economies, if you compare, say, Japan and America, there have been studies done that find that since the 1980s, those two countries have had very disparate economic growth. Japan was expected to be one of the largest economies in the world. I think it was the second largest in the 80s and 90s, and it slipped backwards a lot since then. And the reason it slipped backwards is probably all about population. So while other countries have been able to have growing populations, and that means that there's more people producing and consuming and just the economic pie in those countries is growing. In Japan, that hasn't happened. Maybe they've gotten a little bit more productive, but there's just been fewer people to the extent that they've really stagnated for a long time. The stagnation is probably a good thing to talk about. There's a lot of thinking around different types of intelligences you get at different ages. So younger people are often have more fluid intelligence, which is very associated with scientific breakthroughs, sort of paradigm-shifting developments, that kind of thing, whereas older people are often very good at synthesizing and at making use of knowledge that's already known.
So that affects the economic dynamism of a country then, if you have less young people looking for those breakthroughs?
Yeah, exactly. But if you look at just the huge challenges we have around climate change and all of that, maybe we need a couple of, really, really big breakthroughs, and that gets harder the more aged your population is. Obviously, you just spend more of your economic wealth on healthcare and aged care. That can make pensions much more expensive as well if you're a society that has them. It also kind of can change your politics. It can make it very hard to actually reform these things because there's just more people numerically who rely on them. So our economy is going to look really different to the style of economy we've had since the Industrial Revolution.
World leaders are starting to recognise these issues and these problems, and you even have some like Donald Trump and Xi Jinping who are bringing back the baby bonus. The pronatalist movement is gaining traction, particularly in the US. Bearing in mind, as you said, that no countries managed to reverse declining fertility rates, will we start to see a demographic arms race?
So I think people who've been proponents of big countries, and this includes Australia with the whole populate or perish thing.
The Commonwealth government is determined that its migration plan shall succeed. If we are to survive as a nation, it must succeed.
They've always made the assessment that big countries are powerful countries. So I don't think in a way that's in any way surprising. When you have more people, you have more geopolitical clout. France, which is a country that's often punched above its weight in geopolitics.
Male and female infertility has progressed a lot in recent years and is causing a lot of couples to suffer. A major plan to combat the scourge will be launched to enable this very demographic reset.
They've launched this, demographically rearming France idea.
So a French president who clearly wants more babies, not fewer.
With fertility tests and maternity leave and all of that to try and boost their fertility rate.
If I'm elected this November, for the first time ever, your government will pay for or require insurance companies to pay for all costs associated with IVF fertility treatment.
Donald Trump is also getting on this bandwagon.
We want more babies to be born in America. We want more babies. We need them. We need them.
So in the United States, probably as part of this geopolitical sort of push, you do have a very explicit pronatalist movement.
So let me say very simply,
J.D. Vance is probably the biggest governmental proponent of that.
I want more babies in the United States of America.
You have people like Elon Musk who almost seem to advocate that people like them, successful, intelligent people should have as close to infinite number of children as they can.
The birth rate is very low in almost every country.
And Musk is very much doing his part. We know of 14 of his children with 4 different women.
And unless that changes, civilization will disappear.
China ended its one-child policy in 2016 and has since, in the last couple of weeks, introduced a baby bonus.
Until their kids turn 3, parents are to receive 3,600 yuan per child every year.
Which I figured out what proportion it is of the average income. It's actually pretty high. It's about 5%.
Okay.
So it's a good little financial boost for people who have children under 3 years old. So this is a geopolitical assessment that you don't want to be a small country. You want to be a big country. You sometimes see this playing out in interesting ways. For instance, with Australia, you had Kevin Rudd.
I actually believe in a big Australia. I make no apology for that.
Who came in with a very long geopolitial career before he became Prime Minister. And he was talking to Ken Henry, the then Treasury Secretary, about what's a sustainable population for Australia. And Ken Henry, who is very concerned with, environmental sustainability, said 15 million. And Kevin Rudd apparently heard 50 million and went off with that, and then was quite disappointed to find out that actually Ken Henry wanted the smaller figure. But yeah, I think this sort of doesn't intersect very cleanly, I think, with ideas of women's empowerment and the like. But just from a geopolitical point of view, there's always been a push to having large families and large numbers of children.
And this is quite a shift, isn't it? Because for many years, there was a push to have a more sustainable population. You've talked about China. They had the one-child policy to try and get richer and reduce poverty. We've had climate change as a big issue and people talking about having more sustainable populations to deal with that. Now the concern is that there won't be enough babies. What's behind the dramatic shift in thinking?
For a very long time, there were far more people alive and then people being born were adding to that because healthcare standards had improved so much. But lately what's happened is that the huge increase in lifespans has sort of had its effect, and now we're not actually increasing all that much more. Meanwhile, we're just having so many fewer kids that they're actually sort of equalizing those two forces. So I think in terms of sustainability, there's really 2 schools of thought on this. One of them is that if you want to reduce your way to a sustainable human footprint, it's probably very helpful to have fewer people if you just have those people using fewer and fewer resources. But then again, there's another school of thought that says, well, that's just not really human nature. Humans are always accumulative. So what we probably need to do is we need to innovate our way to using less carbon and to having a much more cleaner sort of high-tech society that does not have as heavy a human footprint while still having high standards of living. And to get to that second world, you probably do need very high levels of innovation. So it probably helps to have more people and wealthy societies who can invest in that innovation and all of that. So it's probably a bit of a difference in human nature about which of those 2 things you think is more achievable. I would suspect that people don't voluntarily give up a high standard of living. They never really have. So convincing them to use fewer resources in a costless way is probably the only way that society will actually have smaller carbon footprints. One of the things that really worries demographers and economists who've looked at this is that we've had population projections for decades. And if you go back, we actually always overstate how many people there's going to be. There's actually always fewer births than we anticipate. Whatever is causing lower births, and there's lots of theories about that, it's actually a much more powerful force than we often project. So Australia can't avoid the demographic crunch. It's happening all around us, and it's also happening to a lesser extent here. And that's going to play out in all sorts of ways that we're probably not really ready for and probably not even really talking about.
We're talking about the global fertility crisis. The world is facing a shortage of babies, and that has governments scrambling to respond. Miriam, what's happening in Australia? How does Australia's fertility rate compare to other countries? And how has it changed over the years?
Australia currently has a birth rate of 1.5 children per woman, which is quite good for a developed country. It's higher than Canada. It's a smidge lower than the United States. And there also is a lot of complacency around this, and not very many policymakers are actually worried about Australia's population because we just get such high migration, and we've always had more interest in migrating to Australia than we have spots for people to take. So at the moment, about half of our population growth is births and half of it is migration. If you look at sort of recent history, the birth rate was around 3.5 children to every woman through the baby boom period after the war. And then in 1961, you get the oral contraceptive pill introduced in Australia. The birth rate sort of falls steadily, but not all that fast, until 2 decades later, when it's basically slips below replacement, and it's never really gotten above replacement since. It treaded sideways for a long time through the 90s and early 2000s, and then when the John Howard coalition government came in, they introduced a baby bonus. And this came after releasing the intergenerational report that looked at how many taxpayers to tax recipients there would be in a certain hypothetical ageing population scenario into the future. And the government introduced this $3,000 non-means tested payment as a way to encourage people to have children to deal with that. Peter Costello, who was the treasurer at the time, so he brought in the $3,000 bonus, and he had this saying, which was one for mum, one for dad, and one for the country.
One for dad and one for the country.
You know, it's easy to be flippant about it, but it was actually really odd what happened because actually the birth rate did go up. This is not often what tends to happen overseas. You don't get such a strong growth in the birth rate, and it was really quite extraordinary. You know, I spoke to Peter Costello about this, who's just like, oh, you know, people from the OECD were coming to visit, and there were people from all these other countries, and they were all like, well, how did you actually increase your birth rate? There's been a lot of academics who tried to answer this question, and they found that actually what happened was women who had 2 children, when the baby bonus came in, they were more likely to have a third. This is actually exactly what you want to see happen because it suggests that family sizes increased. It wasn't just babies born a little bit earlier than they would have been otherwise to take advantage of this fiscal payment, but it was actually new people being born. It's kind of odd, right? Like, why would $3,000 actually induce you to take on this financial commitment that is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars if you count, you know, childcare and school fees and all of that?
Absolutely.
So it shouldn't have an effect, even though it did. So Costello's view on this is that he thinks it was the public discussion of having children as a positive thing to do for your country that actually flipped people into doing so a little bit more than they had been before. But in 2007, the government lost power and Labor came in. And one of the first things they did was means testing, the baby bonus, and then they abolished it entirely in 2013 and replaced it with a family tax benefit that is also means tested. So in a way, they quickly moved away from this universal benefit idea to poor people should have support in having children, but it shouldn't apply more broadly. And after that, the birth rate fell. Look, maybe it was probably going to do that anyway, given the way these things work, but we sort of gave up the gains made in that period. Costello is quite disappointed about this. He thinks we were leading the pack, and other countries have since really taken up these kind of schemes. And, you know, he thinks we're being complacent and we don't want to talk about this.
And do you think Australia is becoming complacent and not giving this issue enough attention? Should it be something that's part of the discussion at the government's Economic Reform Summit next week?
I think it should, because I think this whole Economic Reform Summit is about productivity, right? And I think it's hard to argue we'll be a more productive society if we are ageing. I can totally see why politicians are reluctant to discuss it. I don't think it fits very well with liberalism and with the belief that you should have your own family and your own life and whatever number of children you want, or not have children at all. I think it's probably no coincidence that a lot of the countries that are making really big moves on this are more authoritarian countries than ours, countries where the government is very happy to tell you to have only one child or to encourage you to have two or that kind of thing. So that's not really our political culture. And there have also been, I guess, people who have tried to put this on the agenda. I think they've been burned, basically. So, there's Kevin Rudd's famous Big Australia debate, where he misheard Kevin Henry saying we should have 15 million people and said, oh, yes, of course, we should have 50. And there was a really big backlash about that. And I don't think anyone has ever really suggested a large migration or large birth focus since.
So a final question, Miriam. You spent a long time researching this issue for your article. You spoke to a lot of experts about it. How worried do you think we should all be about this global fertility crisis?
I think we should definitely be worried and we should definitely be talking about it. Part of the reason is that fertility rates have been falling since the Industrial Revolution and the advance of modern healthcare. We've yet to come upon a society that has successfully reversed the trend. So everywhere they're falling, it is very much no longer a first world problem. It's an everywhere problem. Even places in sub-Saharan Africa that have really high fertility rates still, they have much lower rates than they used to 20 years ago. It's one thing to have falling population in first world countries, but if you have low fertility rates and falling populations in countries that aren't wealthy, will they necessarily have the resources to look after their aging population? I think that's quite concerning and probably something that we need to grapple with. Another way to look at it, though, is that people who have children, they're paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to have them. We as a society are very comfortable paying those kinds of figures to subsidise people's healthcare towards the later part of their life. That just speaks to our values and the kind of society that we want. But I think we're very reticent about payments made at the start of life. And I wonder if that needs to shift, because those payments, if they do have the effect of encouraging people to have more children or making it possible for them to do so, well, that's an investment for your society. Those children are, on average, going to grow up to be taxpayers and to contribute far more than the money expended on them. That's not really the case with healthcare provided towards the end of life, which is more of a compassionate consumption to be the kind of society we want. But it's certainly not as much bang for buck.
Thanks, Miriam.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Financial Review senior writer Miriam Robin joining the podcast today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow and Mandy Coulin. Fiona Buffini is head of premium content. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us, as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.